Hello, my name is Cora Okkema with Michigan State University Extension. Together, we will be going over a pilot study investigating the perspectives of dairy cattle caretakers on udder edema. This work took place from October through December of 2020 and resulted in some interesting findings. Firstly, we're going to explore what is udder edema. Udder edema is classified as a metabolic disorder. Lymphatic fluid is trapped in the tissues of the udder and the surrounding areas, and then the presentation of the disorder primarily occurs around the time of parturition. The development and severity of udder edema is influenced by physiological and anatomical changes occurring in heifers during the gestation period, genetic predisposition, which is tied to milk production potential, age at first calving, nutrition, and oxidative stress. So why should we be concerned about udder edema? Udder edema impacts a number of production and health factors in cows. It is proven to decrease overall milk production and increase the incidence of subclinical ketosis, the risk for clinical mastitis, udder and teat injuries, udder cleft dermatitis, and risk for permanently damaged mammary support structures, specifically the support ligaments. The trends of udder edema prevalence have not been captured in the United States, and in part because of there not being an industry-wide validated udder edema scoring tool being established to help monitor for udder edema. So our objectives for this project were to evaluate current perspectives of dairy caretakers about udder edema itself, their knowledge about factors that influence the development of udder edema, and udder edema monitoring practices. Our methods for this survey and for recruitment: the survey participants included farm owners, herdsmen, farm managers, and herd managers. This survey was a digital survey and developed in Qualtrics and was distributed through a magazine advertisement in Progressive Dairy and in a digital newsletter from the Central Plains Dairy Exposition. On the right of the slide here is that advertisement. The survey itself was a 23-question anonymous survey with questions including Likert scale, multiple choice, dichotomous, and short answer form. And the categories that the questions were broken down into include respondent demographics, farm demographics and production information, and perception statements. Our results overall, we had a total of 30 completed responses be submitted. 2 respondents out of the 30 did indicate that they monitor udder edema on their farms, but it was solely through visual assessment and no record keeping was being taken place. 22 caretakers did state that udder edema is common on their farm, and at minimum 70% of the respondents were aware of the negative effects udder edema has on the cow's health or production. Very quickly, we're going to go over participant demographics and farm production information. So the majority of our participants were farm owners. Next was herd managers, and then we had a farm manager and some others. And most of the participants came from the Midwest or the Northeast area, and the other participants were spattered around the rest of the United States. And we had a near 50-50 split of men and women partaking in this survey. So very quickly, farm demographics. We had quite a range in our herd sizes that were represented within this survey. Smallest amount being 20, largest amount being 5,000. And we gathered some production information for our first and second plus lactation cows. So for our mean average production, we were at 61.2 pounds in our first lactation cows. And then in our second plus lactation cows, we were at 71.8 pounds. To orient you to the Likert scale question style, the response options range from strongly disagree to strongly agree, with a neutral response option of neither agree nor disagree. So this style was used for the perception statements in this survey. So this is broken down into 2 slides, and we're going to work our way down through a couple of these statements just to identify some very interesting findings. So first statement, udder edema is a part of fresh heifer udder health. Majority of our respondents were in agreement to that statement, with the rest either being neither agree nor disagree, or one who strongly disagreed. A very important piece that we wanted to take from this survey as well, training animal caretakers to identify udder edema is important, was a statement that we placed in there, and it was seen that 93.3% of our respondents were in some form of agreement to that statement. And following that, we had 70% of the respondents be in some agreement to the statement that an industry standard rating scale would be useful to monitor udder edema. So we clearly see that there is a need and a want for this type of tool to be developed. And as we said before, 22 respondents did say udder edema was common on their farm. And as it's been highly cited in literature, udder edema is seen more in heifers versus cows, and that was also agreed upon within our respondents. A few of our perception statements involved some management practices for managing and mitigating udder edema. So this perception statement was udder edema can be managed through nutrition, and we had 73.3% of our respondents be in some form of agreement to this statement, with the next majority being neither agree nor disagree. Our next perception statement was udder edema negatively affects milk production. 80% of our respondents were in some form of agreement to this statement. Next, udder edema affects the attachment of the milking unit. 90% of our respondents were in some form of agreement to this statement. And if anybody has had experience milking fresh heifers and fresh cows, they more than likely have come across one that has udder edema, so they know personally this experience as well. Our next perception statement was that high genetic milk production potential increases the risk of udder edema. As this has been cited in literature to be the case, I was very curious to see the knowledge that our caretakers had on this subject as well. And we see that 70% of our caretakers were in some form of agreement to this statement, where the remainder were stated neither agree nor disagree. And then udder edema is a risk factor for mastitis. Once again, this has been cited to be the case in literature, and we had a bit more of a spread from our respondents, but once again, majority of our respondents, in this case being 73.3%, were in some form of agreement to the statement. The final 2 statements, firstly, udder edema is a welfare issue. We did see that 86.7% of our respondents were in some form of agreement to this statement. And in support of that, for the next statement, that udder edema is painful, we did see actually 90% of our respondents be in some form of agreement to that statement itself. Finally, some conclusions and recommendations. Respondents are aware of udder edema on their farms. An education on the negative effects that udder edema has on production and health could provide greater understanding of this disorder. Caretakers stated that training employees to recognize udder edema is important, and that there is interest in an industry-wide scale to monitor udder edema on farm. Additionally, the majority of caretakers indicated that udder edema is painful and a welfare concern. For some recommendations for research, a larger sample population would provide further insight into an industry-wide perceptions of dairy caretakers on udder edema. And thank you so much for listening to my presentation today about my colleagues and I's work. And if you have any questions, feel free to contact me. You can either scan the QR code or reach out to my email on my poster.